Hello, my name is Ziling, and my research is entitled Ghostly Encounters, Specters of Marx and Retranslation. In this paper, I'm going to talk about how the discourse of spectrality in Specters of Marx by French philosopher Jacques Derrida can shed light on the understanding of translation and retranslation. In this book, the author talks about the living on of the spirit of Marxism after the fall of USSR, the promised return of future revolution. My focus on spectrality zooms in on how the returning ghost complicates temporality and how that complicated temporality can be brought into conversation with retranslation theory. As Derrida believes, there are several times of the spectre. No one can be sure if by returning it testifies to a living past or to a living future. So when the ghost does arrive, it calls into question linear temporality, leading to a non-contemporaneity with itself of the living present. This non-contemporaneity is important for this paper, since I'm going to talk about how translation can be rendered uncontemporary with itself by the company of the taxi traces that come back not just from the past, but also from future. Second, I'm going to suggest how the concept of ghost may be relevant for the understanding of the afterlife of text in retranslation. Retranslation, to quote from a definition, refers to a second or later translation of a single source text into the same target language. In the existing literature on retranslation, it has been noticed that retranslations tend to engage themselves with previous versions of translations. For example, they may voluntarily or involuntarily make use of or ignore existing ones. Later versions may submit to and uphold the authority of previous versions. Contrastingly, they may also challenge, resist, or dissent from the predecessors to distinguish themselves. A more overarching theory believes that it is inescapable for all subsequent retranslators to encounter the initial one and take a stance in relation to that. In all these theories, there seems to be an assumption of the linear power hierarchy between early translation and the following ones. That is, the initial or early translation is the one who exerts influence, and the subsequent ones find themselves in a more or less passive position. An exception would be a 2006 article on narrative theory and retranslation theory that briefly suggests that later retranslations can also haunt a previous one in the narrative fields constituted by all the retranslations. However, how that can be achieved remains to be explored. Indeed, the progression of retranslation seems to have tempted us to see the chain of influence as linear. This assumed linearity can be traced back to the belief that the concept of time was bound up with the linearity in the symbols in writing. However, the 2016 movie Arrival by Denis Villeneuve shows how non-linear language, that is, the circular language of the heptapods, can circumvent the natural flow of time and enable people to see future. For example, the protagonist of the movie, a linguist, came to have memories of future as she got command of the language. That is, what will happen in future has happened in the past and has been perceived by her. Although in this case, the language of the heptapods is theatrical, it's not so far from reality, since these circular figures resemble some of the earlier forms of characters of some non-phonetic writing system that is still in use today. If this potential to foresee future is applied to retranslation theory, it can be speculated that early translation or the initial translation already knows what will happen in future, so they inevitably or necessarily betray traces of future retranslations in one way or another. Therefore, I argue that the power hierarchy between retranslations may be circular than linear. That is, as well as haunting future retranslations, existing ones may also be subject to retranslations that are yet to come. To support this argument, I'm going to show you comparative case studies based on Virginia Woolf's 1927 novel To the Lighthouse and 3 of his Chinese retranslations. As for why I use To the Lighthouse, I think it's due to the significance of the manifold temporality in the novel and is challenging the validity of the present by the living on of the dead, which resonates with the theory that I'm using, that is hauntology. I'm going to look at the retranslation of the ghostly presence of the late Mrs. Ramsay as witnessed by Lily Briscoe to show you how initial translation foresees future ones. Prior to that, as a context, I need to let you know the so-called default strategy of the initial translator and the following ones, so that the text traces from the future will show itself. Due to word limit, I cannot show you the case studies that are prior to this paper and that support this so-called default strategy. However, to sum up, in version 1, the ghost of Mrs. Ramsay has been exorcised from the novel to a large extent, with the hauntedness been ironed and rendered as ordinary human memory and literariness, which for convenience sake, I will call a de-haunting strategy. Contrastingly, in version 2 and 3, the ghost has been mostly preserved. By arguing that version 1 has foretold the visibility of ghosts in version 2 and 3, I mean that in version 1, there has been occasional slip of the tongue, which results in the accidental release of the ghost. So in this case, Lily Briscoe found herself sitting next to the late Miss Ramsay in the lighthouse section while she was painting. Mrs. Ramsay, who having gone comes back again, has been depicted as an essence and abstract one, which clearly do not refer to naturalistic human existence. As part of the overall de-haunting strategy of version 1, this essence has been translated as 倩影 in version 1, which refers to the outline of beautiful figures, usually that of females. 倩影 can be seen as a generic literary phrase originated from classic literature to refer to female figures and usually to connote that the figure, and especially the femininity, is being appreciated. Or it could be said that the hauntedness has been eclipsed by literariness. We can actually talk more about this back translation later, because I think it could be more nuanced. However, that will require much more time to explain. So for the time, the rendition of 倩影 delineates the singularity of the word essence by referring to the outline of the woman without specifying the sexual sense. Instead, the rendition locates the term in the context of classic literature, so the hauntedness triggered by the word essence has been replaced by a kind of exquisite literariness. Confirming this de-haunting strategy is the rendition of point 3, that of having gone comes back again. This has been substituted by Lily's looking forward to the coming back of Miss Ramsay. In other words, the translation denies that the dead had come back, which is overtly exorcising the ghost. As a contrast, version 2 and 3 both refer to the essence of Miss Ramsay as an existence, which confirm her reappearance of after death and allows the present to be accompanied by the coming back of the ghost. They also confirm this with the translation of the coming back in point 3. So now I have set the context under which nonlinear haunting would take place. So where is this nonlinear haunting? I think it is brought about by the translation of the abstract one. In version 1, it has been translated as Ziling, which means spectre. Ziling is exactly the same term for the spectre as in the Chinese translation of Specters of Marx. On the contrary, the narrators in version 2 and 3 have not gone so far as to point out the spectre. Instead, they just keep it as an abstract existence or figure, which is in line with their usual strategies. I know at this point, it may give you the impression that I'm drawing a conclusion based on 3 examples, but actually there could be more examples, just that they couldn't be presented in full in this video due to word limit. So I suggest that you could see this case as a prototype of the translation strategies of the 3 translations. So here you can see there is an abrupt appearance of the ghost in version 1, which can be seen as an anachronism in retranslation, since it rings a jarring sound that runs counter to the overall strategy of version 1, but foresees future retranslations in version 2 and 3. So how may this nonlinear haunting take place, and how does this anachronism come into being? I suggest that it may be elicited by the concept of difference, that is the neologism by Derrida. The concept of difference is hard to define. In translation studies, it is usually understood to be the belief that the meaning of a text cannot be fixed and anchored. Instead, the signifiers can be detached from the signifier, with this detachment being unending, leading to a perpetual differing chain. Here, I would like to stress the origin of this deferred meaning. That is, it is believed by Derrida that the unexpected traces of meaning may come out from unconscious. So they can be unpredictable, unfixed, and random. This Derridian unconscious is not one thing. Instead, it differs from and differs itself, leading to a woven of differences that send out delegates, representatives, proxies in a way that gives rise to what Freud calls the uncanny, and in a way that generates radical alterity or misconstruing in the understanding of text. This misconstruing of text on part of the retranslators tends to be inescapable, since difference maintains our relationship with that which we necessarily misconstrue, and which exceeds the alternative of presence and absence. That is, the differentiation chain comes from the unconscious and points to spatial and temporal otherness when we read, which can be seen as non-contemporaneity or the non-presence that accompanies presence. In other words, we necessarily misconstrue the text and think of the ghost while we read. Therefore, in this case, the signifier, the abstract form, has referred not to some abstract presence, but instead to abstract non-presence. It has referred to something potentially vague, with a blurred outline, maybe translucent and semi-visible form of being, which could be the ghost. And that may be why a ghost suddenly came up in version 1 as an anachronism. Importantly, this ghostly presence that was only dimly and unconsciously perceived in version 1 has been fully grasped by version 2 and 3. So this has been my first case. Now proceeding to my second argument concerning the afterlife of translation. In Living on Borderlines, the afterlife of translation is believed to be neither the life nor the death of the text. I would like to interpret this afterlife status from an overtly spectral perspective. I propose that this afterlife of translation can be a ghostly presence. To unfold this argument, I need to introduce how the concept of ghost is set up by Derrida and look at Edmund Chapman's understanding, which is a very recent understanding of afterlife. A spectre is an invisible visibility, which takes a form other than flesh and blood. This invisible aspect of a spectre subverts the solidly living status of the ghostly agent. Meanwhile, its visibility negates it being utterly intangible and dead. So how can this definition of ghost relate to retranslation as the afterlife of text? Chapman points out that the afterlife of text refers not to afterliving, but to overliving, which can be effectuated by translation. That is, translation may release the potentials of a text. These potentials and heterogeneous renditions overlive and transcend the text itself. Importantly for Chapman, these potentials of text are not their possibilities. Possibilities refer to the different strategies in a contextualized condition that defines what a text might become. They more or less suggest neatly arrayed, felicitous, and readily available strategies of translation. Potentials, on the other hand, are engendered from within textuality. They refer to the intrinsic capability of text to be infinitely deferred, leading to an miscellany of translation strategies. I argue that it is this infinitely miscellaneous potential strategies that render retranslations both visible and invisible, or visible at times and invisible at others. To put it clearly, some translation strategies have been adopted, discarded, and adopted again throughout time, which makes the overall landscape of retranslation strategies flickering, unstable, faint, and shimmering, just like the trembling shadows of ghostly light. These negations and rejuvenations of strategies may seem random, and it would be difficult to attribute these choices to tangible contextual particularities, nor does it necessarily fit into a neatly theorized trajectory. To exemplify this, I'm going to show you another case from To Lighthouse. In this case, the ghost of Mrs. Ramsay was not encountered by Lily Briscoe, but instead by Mrs. McNabb, a working woman for the Ramsay family. Mrs. McNabb had seen the ghost of Mrs. Ramsay after her death. So Mrs. McNabb was repeating the chores that she had done when Mrs. Ramsay had been alive. And then she saw the ghost of Mrs. Ramsay in the same way as she was alive. So there was a synchronicity between past and present that led to this hauntedness. That is, before and after the death of Mrs. Ramsay, she had been witnessed by Mrs. McNabb. In the latter occasion, that is, after her death, it could be said that the present moment of Mrs. McNabb's witnessing was accompanied by Mrs. Ramsay's coming back as a ghost. The dead refused to be utterly lifeless. However, as part of the de-haunting strategy, the version 1 translator suppressed the ghost by inserting an at the time or back then in the draft. Or we can see in the draft that the translator has used another strategy, which is point 1. However, we can talk about this later because it would take much more time to explain at this point. But in general, point 1 has also achieved similar generic de-haunting effects. By doing this, the translator filtered this hauntedness by reducing the past accompanying present, in other words, the presence and contemporaneity with itself, to the past on its own. On the contrary, in version 2 and 3, the ghost has not been suppressed. Instead, the presence of the ghost has been strengthened and confirmed. However, in the new edition of version 1, a strategy similar to in the new edition of version 3, a strategy similar to version 1 can be found. And again, the ghost has been banished in a similar way to version 1, or almost in the same way as in version 1. I suggest that it would be difficult to ascribe this unanticipated recurrent strategy in the new version 3 to contextual factors, since the change does not seem to be systematic. However, it attests to the potentials of text and the ephemeral status of retranslation, which is analogous to the ghostly afterlife of translation of text, that is unstable, unpredictable, shimmering, and flickering, and does not necessarily fit into a neat and clean trajectory of retranslation. To conclude, in this paper, I suggested 2 arguments. First, I talked about nonlinear haunting, which may add to the usual sequence of power hierarchy in retranslation. Then I talk about the ghostly afterlife of retranslation. As for the potential future development of this paper, I hope to pay more attention to the mode of translation of version 3, which I haven't mentioned in the paper. So version 3 is an example of crowdsourced literary translation. It first came out online in 2015 and then in print in 2020. Literary translation crowdsourcing is a very recent form of translation whereby the task is finished by communities of amateur translators as opposed to by well-established translators and scholars. This more inclusive form of participation is enabled by the advancement of technology and the transformation of the mediality of literary translation. It encourages more dynamic conversations between amateur translators and invites more diverse voices, which may complement or challenge what we have previously theorized about retranslation. Specters of Marx was written in the time of Web 1.0. However, I still find it insightful in the participatory culture nowadays. In that sense, these potential future projects may alternatively be titled Specters of Derrida and Translation in Web 2.0. But this is just one of my suggestions of future topics. And as for this paper, I've finished my paper for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you.